The name card was Leonard's first mistake. He had placed it himself, personally, deliberately, right there in the front row of St. Aurelius Cathedral. Gold-embossed letters on ivory cardstock. Mira Cindy. Seat 1A. Dead center. Close enough that she would feel the organ music vibrate in her chest. Close enough that she would have no choice but to watch his face when the woman he chose walked down the aisle toward him. He had even smiled doing it. His groomsmen had asked him why he bothered inviting her at all. Leonard had straightened his cufflink, a habit he'd stolen from Mira's late father, and said simply, because she needs to see what losing looks like. 300 guests. White roses on every pew. A string quartet playing something expensive. The kind of wedding that got photographed for magazines. Leonard had built this moment like an architect builds a monument, brick by careful brick, designed to outlast Mira's dignity. He just didn't account for what she would build in return. Nobody noticed the cars at first. That was the thing about power that Leonard had never understood. Real power doesn't announce itself. It simply arrives, and the air in the room changes before anyone can explain why. 5 black vehicles. No logos. No noise beyond the low, predatory rumble of engines that cost more than most people's homes. They lined the curved driveway of St. Aurelius Cathedral with the unhurried precision of men who had never once been told to wait. The valet who stepped forward took one look at the first car's occupant and stepped back. Inside the cathedral, the string quartet was mid-bow, ringing something delicate from their instruments, when the great front doors opened. And the music, simply, stopped. Not because anyone gave an order. Not because the conductor raised a hand. The sound died the way fire dies when the oxygen leaves a room. Instinct. Pure, cellular instinct. She walked in wearing red and gold. Not the soft red of roses or romance. The structured, unapologetic red of a woman who had spent 7 months deciding exactly how she wanted to re-enter a room that had tried to erase her. Her gown's architectural train moved behind her like a statement being written across the marble floor. Her sweetheart neckline was precise. Her posture was a sentence, upright, complete, finished, the posture of someone who had already decided the outcome before she walked through the door. Her face held no anger. That was what made it devastating. Mira Cindy looked at Leonard's carefully constructed Cathedral of Triumph with the calm, settled expression of a woman who had already seen the last page. And beside her stood a man that 300 guests did not recognize, but somehow already feared. He was broad and unhurried in a pitch-black suit tailored to silence. The top button of his collar was open, not from carelessness, but because the black ink tattoos wrapping his neck and crossing his knuckles were not something a man like Seon Kim hid. They were a record. Evidence. A history written on skin that told anyone with sense exactly who they were looking at. His gaze moved across the cathedral the way a man surveys something he is deciding whether to keep. Behind them, filling the doorway in a clean, immovable line, stood men in white suits. Sharp. Still. Their expressions coiled like held breath. The guests nearest the aisle didn't consciously decide to move back, their bodies simply made the decision for them. Up at the altar, Leonard's face did something that would take him years to forget. His carefully built architecture, the name card, the front row seat, the 300 witnesses to Mira's humiliation, collapsed in the space between one heartbeat and the next. Because the seat he had reserved for her. She didn't take it. She didn't need it. Mira Cindy walked to the center of that cathedral and simply stood, red gold and absolute, while the most dangerous man in the city stood at her shoulder like a kingdom pledging its flag. Leonard had invited her to watch him win. He had forgotten that the woman he betrayed had a very different definition of winning. Before we begin, if you're new here, please like, subscribe, and drop a comment telling me where you're watching from. I want to say hello to every single one of you, because this story, you do not want to miss a single chapter of what's coming. Nobody noticed the cars at first. That was always how it worked with power that didn't need to perform itself. It arrived quietly, and the atmosphere shifted before anyone could name the reason why. 5 black vehicles rolled up the curved stone driveway of St. Aurelius Cathedral in downtown Chicago with the kind of deliberate, unhurried silence that made the 2 valets on duty exchange a glance and then, without a word between them, choose to stay exactly where they were. Inside, The cathedral was everything Leonard had designed it to be. 300 guests arranged in white-ribboned pews. Tall cathedral ceilings draped in cascading ivory florals. A string quartet positioned near the altar playing something that cost him $4,000 for the afternoon. The light through the stained glass fell in columns of amber and rose, and every single detail, from the monogrammed programs to the gold-dipped centerpieces, had been chosen to communicate one thing above all others. He had won. Leonard Ashworth stood at the altar in a perfectly pressed tuxedo and surveyed his kingdom with the quiet satisfaction of a man who had spent 11 months constructing a moment. He had thought of everything. Catered the menu himself. Approved the floral arrangements personally. And placed, in the front row, dead center, a single gold-embossed name card in ivory cardstock that read, Mira Cindy. Seat 1A. Close enough that she would feel the organ music in her sternum. Close enough that she would have no choice but to watch. He had even smiled placing it. His best man, Theo, had leaned over at the rehearsal dinner and quietly asked if inviting her was wise. Leonard had straightened his cufflink, a silver and onyx set he'd bought with the first check he'd written from her company's redirected account, and said, "She needs to understand that some people are built for winning and some people are built to watch." Theo had not asked again. So at 2:47 on a Saturday afternoon, when the cathedral doors swung open and the October air came through like a verdict, Leonard was looking at his bride. He didn't notice the quartet losing their notes one by one, the way a fire loses its oxygen, strand by strand, until there was nothing left but silence. He noticed when 300 heads turned. Then he turned too. She came through the doors wearing a red and gold gown so precisely structured it looked less like clothing and more like an architectural decision. The deep sweetheart neckline was exact. The heavy train moved behind her across the marble floor in slow, deliberate sweeps, like the final sentence of a letter written with absolute certainty. Her posture was straight in a way that said nothing about arrogance and everything about resolution. The posture of a woman who had already settled the matter before she arrived. Her face was calm. Not composed the way people are composed when they're holding something down. Calm the way a finished thing is calm. Complete. Decided. And beside her. Beside Mira walked a man that no one in that cathedral could name, but every single body in the room already understood. He was broad. Built in the way that certain men are built, not for aesthetics but as a natural consequence of being exactly what he was. His pitch-black suit was tailored to a precision that made Leonard's tuxedo look, suddenly, like something borrowed. His collar was open at the top, not from carelessness, but because the black ink tattoos wrapping his neck and crossing his knuckles were not something Seon Kim covered. They were a record. A history. A warning written in permanent ink on permanent skin. His eyes moved across the cathedral the way a man studies something he is deciding what to do with. Behind them, filling the doorway shoulder to shoulder in a clean, absolute line, stood men in white suits. Sharp lapels. Still hands. Expressions that were not threatening in the theatrical sense but in the quiet, geological sense, the way a mountain range is threatening simply by existing. The guests nearest the aisle did not consciously decide to step back. Their bodies simply made the decision without them. Leonard's mouth opened. Nothing came out. The name card in the front row, seat 1A, gold embossed, placed by his own hand, sat untouched as Mira Cindy walked past it without a single glance downward, and came to stand in the center of his cathedral like something he had no category for. He had built this day to be her lowest point. He was only now beginning to understand what he had actually built. It had started on a Tuesday. Mira would think about that later, in the cold months after, in the quiet apartment with the leaking kitchen faucet and the second-hand furniture, and she would think about how ordinary the day had seemed. How she had stopped for coffee on the way in. How she had been humming something under her breath in the elevator. How she had been, in the most unguarded and ordinary way, happy. Cindy Mira Cole had built Cole Creative Industries from a single rented desk in a shared workspace in Wicker Park when she was 24 years old. By 31, she occupied the entire 14th floor of a glass tower on Michigan Avenue, employed 62 people, and had a name in the industry that people used carefully, the way they use things they respect. She had done it without family money, without connections, without anyone handing her a starting line. She had done it entirely on the architecture of her own mind. Leonard had come into her life at 28, introduced at a charity gala by a mutual friend who'd said, "He's in finance, he's charming, and he actually reads." He had been all three. He was warm in the specific way that skilled people are warm, attentive in the right moments, funny without trying too hard, the kind of man who remembered small things you mentioned once and brought them up 6 weeks later like they mattered to him. They had gotten engaged on New Year's Eve. She had cried. He had kissed her forehead in the way that felt, at the time, like being chosen. What Mira did not know was that Leonard had been studying her company's structure for 2 years before he met her. Did not know that the mutual friend who'd introduced them was on Leonard's payroll. Did not know that every month he spent in her apartment, learning the rhythm of her schedule and the names of her board members, he was building a different kind of architecture entirely. On that Tuesday, the ordinary Tuesday with the coffee and the humming, Mira arrived on the 14th floor 30 minutes earlier than anyone expected. The conference room glass was frosted, but not fully. She could see shapes, silhouettes. She could hear, when she stood close enough to the door, Leonard's voice moving through numbers with the practiced fluency of someone who had been doing this for a long time. She pushed the door open. Leonard was at the head of her conference table. Her conference table. Beside him sat a woman Mira had never seen. Mid-40s, dark suit, the specific expression of someone who has been brought in to finalize something, and spread across the table were documents that took Mira's trained eye less than 4 seconds to read. Restructuring papers. Ownership transfer documents. Her company. Her name. Being quietly, methodically, surgically removed. Leonard looked up. And in the half-second before his expression reorganized itself into something that resembled regret, Mira saw what was actually there. Inconvenience. Not guilt. Not shame. The mild, practical inconvenience of a man whose timeline had been disrupted by an unexpected arrival. "Mira," he said, and even then, even in that moment, his voice was steady. "Let me explain." She didn't speak. She stood in the doorway of her own conference room and looked at the papers on her own table and the stranger in her chair and the man she had agreed to marry, and she understood, with a clarity that felt almost physical, that she had trusted without conditions a person who had been counting every one. She turned and walked back to her office. Her hands were perfectly still. She didn't cry until she was inside with the door closed, and even then, it lasted exactly 90 seconds. Then she stopped, because she had work to do. She thought she would have time to fix it. She did not. By Thursday, it was over. She arrived at the building at 7 in the morning to find her keycard deactivated. The security guard at the front desk, a man named Roy who had worked the morning shift for 3 years, who knew her coffee order, who had a daughter named after a river, looked at her with something between pity and carefully managed blankness and told her that her access had been suspended pending a board review. "Roy," she said quietly. "I'm sorry, Ms. Cole," he said, and she could see that he meant it, which made it worse, not better. The board review had been Leonard's final move. He had spent 11 months getting close enough to her inner circle to know which board members had grievances, which had ambitions that outpaced their current positions, and which simply wanted to back whoever was going to win. He had made his case to each of them privately, in language calibrated to whatever each person cared about most. By the time Mira arrived at that building on Thursday morning, the vote was already done. She stood on the pavement of Michigan Avenue while the revolving door spun behind her and spat out the small cardboard box that Roy had packed with the items from her desk, a framed photo, a ceramic mug, a succulent she'd kept alive for 4 years. She stood there holding the box with both hands while foot traffic moved around her like water around a stone, and she looked up at the building's facade. The letters were already coming down. 2 men on a suspended platform, working with the quiet efficiency of people being paid by the hour, were removing the C from Cole Creative Industries while she watched. It took 11 minutes for her entire name to disappear from the building she had spent 7 years filling with her work. She did not look away. She watched every letter come down. She owed herself that much, to witness the whole thing, to not flinch from the complete picture of what had been done. When the last letter was loaded into a crate and the platform descended, Mira picked up her cardboard box, adjusted it under one arm, and walked to the end of the block, where she sat down on a bench and allowed herself exactly 5 minutes to feel the full weight of it. Then she stood up, hailed a cab, and started thinking about what came next. What came next, for 4 months, was survival. A sublease on a studio apartment in Logan Square. A part-time position at a small print and design shop in Wicker Park. A place called Steadfast Press, run by a quiet man in his 60s named Mr. Okafor, who asked no questions about her resume and paid cash on Fridays. It was not what she had been. It was also, she discovered, not nothing. She worked late most nights. The shop was still and warm after Mr. Okafor locked up, and Mira would sit at the wide work table in the back with her laptop and her notes and begin the slow, careful process of rebuilding what she could from the outside. She was patient in a way she had never been before. Being hollowed out, she was learning, also hollows out the panic. When you have lost the thing you were most afraid of losing, the fear loses its teeth. She did not know, on those late nights, that the door at the back of the shop was about to change everything. It was a Thursday in February, and the rain was the kind that didn't fall so much as hang, a cold, dense sheet of it that turned the streetlights into blurred halos and soaked through a coat in under 2 minutes. Mira was the only one in the shop. It was past 10. She had the back work table lit with the single overhead lamp, a half-eaten container of rice beside her laptop, and a legal brief on the screen that she had read 4 times without retaining a word. She was tired in the bone-deep way that had become her baseline, and she was considering leaving when she heard it, a sound at the back door. Not a knock exactly. More like a weight against the frame. She stood up slowly. The back door of Steadfast Press opened onto an alley that connected Wicker Park's secondary grid of streets, and in 4 months of late nights, nothing had ever come through it. She picked up the long-handled layout roller from the work table, a ridiculous weapon, but the only one available, and crossed to the door. She opened it. He nearly fell through it. He was tall, that was the first thing, the sheer scale of him filling the doorframe, and his black shirt was soaked through and dark at the left side in a way that, once her eyes adjusted, she understood was not rain. He had one hand braced against the frame and the other pressed to his ribs, and when he looked at her, his eyes were sharp and clear in a way that seemed to be operating somewhat independently from the rest of his body, which was making a quiet but determined argument for collapsing. The tattoos on his neck and hands were the first things she noticed after the blood. Inside, she said, because she was a woman who had spent 7 years making decisions under pressure, and whatever else had been taken from her, that had not. He came through the door without argument. She sat him down on the work table, clearing her laptop and the rice with one efficient sweep, and went to the first aid kit above the utility sink. It was a good kit. Mr. Okafor was thorough about things like that. She worked quickly and without asking unnecessary questions, which he seemed to note, because he watched her hands with the focused attention of someone calibrating whether to trust a thing. The wound was a deep laceration along the left side of his ribs, clean-edged, not a fall injury. She cleaned it, pressed it, bandaged it with the focus of someone who had once spent 3 weeks as a volunteer first responder during a semester abroad and had never forgotten the training. "You should go to a hospital," she said. "No," he said. His English was precise, slightly formal. "It'll need stitches." "I'm aware." She looked at him. He looked back. His expression was not threatening, it was something more specific than that. Measuring. The way an engineer looks at a structure, assessing load-bearing capacity. "Then I need butterfly closures," she said. "I have them." She applied them. He didn't flinch once. When she was done, she sat back and looked at him, this enormous, tattooed, bleeding stranger who had arrived through the back door of a print shop on a Thursday night in February, and said, simply, "Do you need anything else?" He was quiet for a moment. "Water," he said. She got him water. He drank it slowly. The rain hammered the alley door. She went back to her laptop, because she was a practical woman and the brief still needed reading, and he sat on the edge of the work table and watched her work in a silence that was, strangely, not uncomfortable. An hour later, he stood. Tested his balance. Rolled his shoulder once. "You didn't ask," he said. She looked up. "It wasn't my business." Something shifted in his expression. Small, almost invisible, but she caught it. Like a door opening a single inch to let in light. He picked up his jacket from the stool where she'd draped it and reached into the interior pocket. He placed the card on the table beside her laptop. Matte black. No logo. Just a name, Sion Kim, and below it, a phone number. Nothing else except what he said as he pulled on his jacket with careful, measured movements that accommodated the bandaging. If you ever need anything. Not call me. Not let me know. The phrasing was deliberate. A door, not an obligation. An offer structured with the precision of a man who understood the difference between help and debt. Mira looked at the card for a moment, then looked up. You should change the bandaging in 24 hours, she said. The corner of his mouth moved. It was not quite a smile. It was the precursor of a smile, in a face that had clearly not practiced the full version in some time. I will, he said. He went back through the door into the rain. She heard nothing, no car, no voices, no footsteps. As if he had stepped off the edge of the world as quietly as he had arrived. She picked up the card. Held it. Set it back down. She went back to the legal brief. She read it through twice more before she finally absorbed it. Then she turned off the work table lamp, put Seon Kim's card in the inside pocket of her bag where she kept things she intended to keep, and went home through the February rain. She did not call the number for 3 months. She thought about it sometimes. Wondered who he was. She was not naive. The tattoos, the wound, the refusal of a hospital, the men who she suspected had been waiting in the alley and who she had deliberately not looked for, she understood the general shape of his world without needing the specifics. What she thought about more was the particular quality of his stillness when she'd been working. How he had watched her with the attention of someone who was not accustomed to being helped by people who wanted nothing in return. How he had said if you ever need anything as if he meant it as a balance. As if the offer was a form of accounting, and he was a man who kept his accounts. She did not call for 3 months. Then the envelope arrived. If you're still reading, first of all, I see you. Drop a comment below and tell me where you're watching from, I want to say hello. And if you haven't subscribed yet, please do, because what happens next is exactly what you came for. It came in a cream-colored envelope with no return address, slipped under the door of her Logan Square apartment on a Tuesday morning. The same day of the week as everything else Leonard had done to her, which she suspected was not accidental. The outer envelope was formal. Inside it was a wedding invitation. Thick cardstock, gold foil lettering, St. Aurelius Cathedral, the kind of printed object that announced its own expense before you read a word. Leonard Ashworth and Celeste Wren. Together with their families. The date was 6 weeks away. Beneath the invitation, tucked against the back of the envelope, was a small card written in Leonard's handwriting. She recognized it immediately, the deliberate, architectural slant of it, the way he pressed too hard when he wanted something to be read as permanent. It said, "Front row is reserved for you. Come see how real winners live." Mira stood in her apartment doorway in her coat, still holding her keys, and read it twice. The second time, she was calmer than the first, which was the direction she had learned to move in. She set both cards on her kitchen counter. Put the kettle on. Made tea. Stood at her window looking out at the grey March street while the city moved below with its usual indifference, and she thought about the specific architecture of what Leonard had done. The invitation itself was designed to be declined. Nobody would blame her for not attending the wedding of the man who had stolen her company. He knew that. The cruelty was in the option he was offering. Come and be humiliated, or stay home and let him tell the story of how she couldn't face him. Either way, the narrative was his. Unless she changed the terms entirely. She went to her bag. Found the interior pocket. Pulled out the matte black card. She looked at it for a long moment, standing in her kitchen with the tea going warm in her hands, and she thought about a man who sat on a work table in a print shop at 10 o'clock on a Thursday night in February and watched her work with the careful attention of someone recalibrating their understanding of a thing. She picked up her phone. He answered on the second ring. "Mira Cole," he said. Not a question. As if he had been expecting the call. "You said if I ever needed anything," she said. A pause. Brief. "Yes. I need to attend a wedding," she said. And she told him everything. Not because she owed him the full story, but because she was done editing herself for the benefit of people who had already shown her who they were. She spoke for 6 minutes. He did not interrupt once. When she finished, there was a silence that lasted exactly long enough to feel considered. 6 weeks, he said. "Yes. Send me the address." She did. That night, She slept better than she had in 4 months. He arrived at her apartment on a Saturday morning 3 weeks before the wedding with 2 people she didn't know and a calm efficiency that suggested he had thought about this considerably more than she had. One of the 2, a woman named Jin, sharp-featured and unhurried, spent 40 minutes taking Mira's measurements with the focused attention of someone who treated every millimeter as a moral commitment. The other, a quiet man carrying 2 aluminum cases, photographed the apartment's light and Mira's face from 7 different angles without explaining why, and Mira, who was learning that Seon Kim's people communicated primarily through action, did not ask. Seon Kim himself sat at her small kitchen table with a cup of tea she'd made him and looked at the invitation Leonard had sent. He read the handwritten note on the back without expression. "He wanted you to feel small," he said. "Yes," she said. "That's a significant miscalculation." He looked up at her then, and in the full light of her apartment kitchen, she saw his face with a clarity she hadn't had in the low lamp of the print shop. He was not a conventionally handsome man. He was a man whose face had been used for serious purposes and showed it, the jaw set too firmly, the eyes too direct for comfort. But there was something in the way he looked at her that she had only ever experienced once before, in the expression of a professor who'd read her undergraduate thesis and said, "You've actually understood something here." Recognition. The specific warmth of being seen accurately. "I'm not going there for revenge," she said, because she wanted him to know that. "I'm going because he told a story about me. I want to tell a different one." "I know," he said. He turned the invitation over once more. "That's why I agreed." He stayed for 2 hours. He told her nothing of the logistics, which she understood meant the logistics were not her concern and were already handled. He asked her 3 questions: whether she wanted Leonard to be afraid, whether she wanted Leonard to be exposed, or whether she simply wanted Leonard to understand what he had underestimated. She thought about it carefully. "The third one," she said. He nodded slowly, as if that was the answer he'd expected. "Then we do this correctly." 3 weeks later, Jin delivered a red and gold gown to Mira's apartment in a black garment bag with no logo. It fit without a single alteration required. Mira stood in front of her bathroom mirror in the structured, architectural weight of it and looked at herself for a long time. She did not look like a woman who had lost something. She looked like a woman who had decided what she was worth and arranged her life accordingly. She wore it to bed that night, just for a moment, just standing in her small apartment with its second-hand furniture and its leaking faucet, and she understood, for the first time in 4 months, that she was not rebuilding what she had been. She was building something better. The string quartet stopped on a B-flat. That was the specific note, a B-flat held mid-bow by the second violinist, who simply lost the thread of it the moment the cathedral doors opened and did not find it again. The note died and the cathedral, all 300 guests of it, turned in the sudden silence like a single organism responding to a change in the environment. Mira did not hurry. She had learned, in the 7 months since a Tuesday morning in her conference room, that hurry was for people who weren't sure they were going to arrive. She walked at the pace of someone for whom arrival was already settled, her gold-trimmed train sweeping the marble in long, deliberate arcs, her posture carrying the quiet authority of a decision fully made. Seon Kim walked beside her with his hands loose at his sides and his gaze moving across the cathedral in the unhurried, possessive way of a man assessing the dimensions of a room he is considering acquiring. The pitch-black suit. The open collar. The ink on his neck catching the amber light of the stained glass in a way that made the tattoos look, in this particular cathedral on this particular afternoon, less like marks and more like scripture. Behind them, filling the doorway in a line that was precise without being rehearsed, came the men in white suits. 8 of them. Shoulders level, expressions contained, hands folded in front of them with a stillness that communicated, not aggression, exactly, but permanence. The kind of stillness that says, "We are not here temporarily." The guests in the nearest pews didn't move backward consciously. They moved the way objects move in the wake of something larger passing, repositioned by physics, not decision. The mother of the bride put her hand over her mouth. Theo, Leonard's best man, turned to look at Leonard with an expression that asked a question Leonard had no answer to. And Leonard at his altar in his tuxedo in his cathedral, looked at Mira with a face doing things it had never done in the 11 months she had known him. The careful architecture of the man collapsed in real time. Not dramatically. Not all at once. The way a well-built structure fails when one foundational element gives, a quiet, structural surrender that starts in the eyes and moves down. Mira let him look. She stood in the center of the aisle and let the full weight of the moment settle over the room like weather. She did not look away from him. She did not look at the name card in the front row that he had placed with his own hands. She looked at Leonard Ashworth with the complete, settled calm of a woman who had already lived past this moment in her mind and knew exactly how it ended. The silence stretched. One of the women in the third row leaned to her husband and whispered something. The husband didn't respond. He was watching Seon Kim, who had shifted his gaze from the general assessment of the cathedral to the specific, deliberate, unmistakable assessment of Leonard. Leonard's new fiancée, Celeste, standing at the altar beside him in a gown that cost more than Myra's first office lease, gripped her bouquet with both hands and said nothing. A child in the back row asked its mother, in a carrying whisper, why the music had stopped. Nobody answered. Seon Kim moved without announcement. He stepped forward from Myra's left side with the unhurried, load-bearing calm of a man who had done significant things in small spaces and was unimpressed by ceremony. He walked up the aisle not with aggression but with the specific velocity of someone crossing a distance they have already measured and found acceptable. The guests on either side did not obstruct him. They redistributed, the way water redistributes around a moving object, without drama. He stopped 4 feet from the altar. Leonard made a sound, not a word, exactly. More like the beginning of one. Seon Kim reached inside his jacket and produced a folder. Matte black. Thick. He held it out toward Leonard with one hand, his expression carrying the particular neutrality of someone extending a thing that will explain itself. Mr. Ashworth, he said. His voice was even, quiet, and entirely audible in the absolute silence of the cathedral. You have something that belongs to someone else. Leonard looked at the folder. He did not take it immediately. His eyes moved from the folder to Seon Kim's face to Mira standing in the center of the aisle, and in those 3 movements, 300 people watched him understand something. The color evacuation was not immediate. It moved through him in stages, like a tide going out. First from his face. Then from his hands, which had been at his sides and now pressed flat against his thighs. Then from the whole bearing of him, that careful, warm, calculated presence that had once made a mutual friend say he actually reads, until what remained at the altar was a man in a tuxedo that had stopped fitting him somewhere in the last 4 minutes. His attorney, the woman from the conference room, Mira recognized her now, seated in the third row, stood up. She stopped when one of the men in white suits stepped forward. She sat back down. Leonard took the folder. He opened it with hands that had stopped being steady. Inside were documents Mira had not seen but had understood were coming. She knew Seon Kim's people had been working, had understood from the quality of his stillness over the past 3 weeks that something comprehensive was being built. What she had not known was the scope. She watched Leonard's eyes move down the first page. Then the second. Then stop entirely. The documents were a full forensic account of the restructuring. Bank records. Transfer histories. The original board communications, obtained through means that Mira did not ask about and Seon Kim had not volunteered. Legal filings that would, according to the attorney Seon Kim had retained, a woman named Patricia Osei from a firm that did not advertise but was known in certain circles the way silent things are known, constitute grounds for full restitution, disgorgement of profits, and a fraud case that had been, as of that morning, filed with the appropriate federal office. 300 guests watched Leonard Ashworth read his own accounting at his own altar. The minister, who had been standing to the side with the patient expression of a man who had seen most things, quietly stepped back. Celeste said, in a voice that carried more shock than grief, "Leonard, what is this?" He didn't answer her. He looked up from the folder at Mira. And for a moment, just a moment, she saw something cross his face that she recognized from the conference room. Not regret. Not exactly. The specific, precise shock of a man who had spent 11 months building a structure and was only now discovering that someone else had been building underneath it the entire time. The wedding, Seon Kim said, in the same even, quiet voice, is going to need to be rescheduled. She walked out of St. Aurelius Cathedral at 3:14 on a Saturday afternoon in October with the deed to a life. Not literally. The legal process would take months, and Patricia O'Say had already told her to expect 18 months of proceedings before the company was fully returned to her name. But the deed in the way that mattered most, the narrative. The story Leonard had tried to own, the one with her name in the front row watching someone else win, was no longer his. It was hers. Completely and permanently hers. Behind her, in the cathedral she had walked out of without looking back, Leonard Ashworth was on his knees on the marble floor in his $3,000 tuxedo, and the 300 guests he had assembled to witness his triumph were doing the silent, specific arithmetic of people recalibrating who they had been backing. She knew, without needing to see it, that several of the board members who had voted against her were currently having private conversations with their phones. She knew that Celeste had left through a side door. She knew that Theo was standing at the altar steps looking at the folder with the expression of a man composing a resignation. She did not need to watch any of it. She had seen enough. The October air outside the cathedral was clean and cold and smelled like fallen leaves and exhaust and the particular sharp clarity of a city that does not stop for personal reckonings. Mira stood on the stone steps and breathed it in, and the train of her red and gold gown spread behind her on the steps in the late afternoon light, and she felt, not triumphant, exactly. Not the bright, electric feeling of a win. Something quieter and more permanent. The feeling of a weight that had been removed. The feeling of a name being reinstated on a building from which it should never have come down. Seon Kim came through the doors behind her. He stood at the top of the steps beside her in the October light. The syndicate men in white filed quietly to the vehicles, which were already pulling back around the driveway with the same unhurried precision with which they'd arrived. Jin was in the first car. The attorney was on a call. Mira looked at the city. Seon Kim looked at the city. "It'll take time," she said. "The legal process." "Yes," he said. Patricia said 18 months. "She's good," he said. "Probably 14. Mira almost smiled. She turned to look at him, this man she had met through a back door in a February rainstorm, this man who had sat in her kitchen and asked her 3 careful questions and listened to the answers with the full weight of his attention, and she found him already looking at her. Not with the measuring quality she'd first seen. With something that had no business name and did not require one. "I owe you," she said. "No," he said. "You gave me 3 stitches and a glass of water and didn't ask a single question. That's a debt I carried for 4 months." She looked at him for a long moment. "The card said if you ever need anything," she said. "It did. What do you need?" He was quiet. The October wind moved past them and lifted the edge of her train. Below, on the cathedral steps, 2 photographers who had been hired to document Leonard's triumph were still standing with their cameras at their sides, unsure what to do with themselves. "Dinner," Seon Kim said finally. "Somewhere quiet. I know a place in Wicker Park." Something in Mira's chest, something that had been clenched and careful for 7 months, since a Tuesday morning with coffee and humming, loosened. Not collapsed. Not broke. Released. The specific, earned release of attention that has finally served its purpose and is no longer needed. "I know a place too," she said. He looked at her, and this time the corner of his mouth moved all the way. It was not a large smile. But on his face, in the October light on the steps of a cathedral where man had tried to build her humiliation, it was the kind of smile that felt like the first line of a different story. He stepped down beside her and offered his hand, not to lead, not to guide. An equal motion. The way you offer your hand to someone you have decided to walk beside. She took it. And Mira Cindy Cole, whose name had been taken off a building, whose company had been signed away on a conference table, who had sat on a sidewalk bench holding a cardboard box and watched her letters come down one by one, walked down the cathedral steps in red and gold with her head level and her posture straight, and a man at her side who had looked at her once, correctly, and decided she was worth standing next to. Behind her, the cathedral held Leonard on his knees and 300 witnesses and a folder full of truths he had hoped would never be assembled. Before her, the city held 14 months of legal proceedings, and a company to rebuild, and a quiet dinner in Wicker Park, and the particular long work of becoming the version of yourself that emerges after you have survived the thing you thought would end you. It was, she thought, a very good beginning. And that is where we leave Mira and Seon Kim for now. She walked into that cathedral as the woman Leonard thought he had finished. She walked out as the woman he will spend the rest of his life trying to forget. Leonard built a front row seat for her humiliation. She turned it into a throne. If this story moved you, if you felt every single moment of what Mira carried and what she reclaimed, then this channel is exactly where you belong. Hit that subscribe button right now so you never miss a chapter, because I promise you, what is coming next in this story will leave you speechless. And before you go, drop a comment telling me where in the world you are watching from. I read every single one. I want to say a personal hello to you, because the fact that you watched this all the way to the end means everything to me. Like this video if you believe that every person who was counted out deserves a comeback. Share it with someone who needs to be reminded that the story isn't over just because someone tried to write them out of it. Mira's company is coming back. Seon Kim's past is coming forward. And Leonard is only just beginning to understand what he set in motion.